If you are someone who has lived on planet Earth at any point between now and about the mid-1950s, then the chances are that you're very familiar with the name Sony. But for those of us who take audio a bit more seriously than your average consumer, especially portable audio, Sony holds a very special place in all of our hearts. If you grew up in the 1980s or 90s and you were fortunate enough to own a Walkman, then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The Walkman line of portable cassette players changed our world, so much so that in 1983, only 4 years after the release of the first Walkman, cassettes outsold vinyl records for the first time in history. Such was the impact of the Walkman. Even the name Walkman had such an influence on our culture and language that it was officially added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 1986. Basically, what Walkmans did for portable analog music playback is very similar to what the iPod did for portable digital music playback in 2001. Truth be told, I don't actually know which had a bigger impact on our culture, Walkmans or iPods. But one thing we can be pretty sure of is that the iPod probably would not have ever existed if it wasn't for the Sony Walkman. But as we've systematically, but not quite completely, replaced analog cassettes in favor of various digital formats, Sony too has had to keep up in order to really stay relevant amid competing products from the likes of Apple and more recently FiiO, Shanling and iBasso, just to name a few. One of their most recent offerings is this, the NW-A55, a well-designed and well-priced standalone portable digital player. Perhaps the first thing that will strike you about the A55 is just how familiar it looks. And that's because Sony have been using what seems to be an identical design for the A40 series, as well as the A30 series, which came before even that. It's by no means a bad design, and maybe Sony is sticking to a if it ain't broke, don't fix it approach. But I'd be lying if I said I don't wish there was a bit more of a modern flair in the design. The front is dominated by the 3.1-inch TFT display, which has a resolution of 800 by 480 pixels, which in turn gives you a nice crisp pixel density of 300 ppi. If we look really closely, we can see some slight pixelation, but from normal viewing angles and distances, the text remains very sharp and legible. The only area where I'd say that the limitation of the display becomes far more obvious is when scrolling through the library and it shows these small album art images. But really, this isn't something that bothers me. The left side houses the micro SD card slot, which is protected by a color-matched flap. There is a small rubber gasket here, which should offer a reasonable amount of protection against dust, but this in no way, shape or form means that the device has any sort of protection against water. Over on the right side are all of the buttons, which include a power button, a volume rocker, a play pause and skip buttons, and finally a hold switch. The hold function is something we don't really see very often, and what it allows you to do is to essentially block all forms of input apart from the power button. This is rather useful if you use the device during activities and you want to avoid any unintended button presses from interrupting your music. Along the bottom is an area to attach some form of lanyard or wrist strap. There's a proprietary 22-pin WM port and a 3.5mm single-ended headphone jack. It's a real pity to see Sony still clinging to this proprietary data port, as it means connecting the A55 to external devices such as an external DAC really requires a very specific cable. FiiO does make such a cable, but the other end is terminated with a micro USB connection, so that limits you to using DACs that have a micro USB input, not Type-C, or even full-size USB connectors like those found on iFi's micro and nano portable DACs. What really confuses me is that this proprietary connector would have made total sense if Sony had a whole bunch of accessories and docks that greatly extended the functionality of the device via this 22-pin port. But there are practically none. If we think back to when the iPod, and especially the first few iPod Touches, were the portable music players to have, there were tons and tons and tons
and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons
of options out there in the form of home entertainment systems and portable speakers that incorporated the proprietary Apple connector, which then allowed you to dock the iPod into that device. But for Sony, there seems to be hardly any at all. It also means that if you're traveling for any extended amount of time, then you need to take your WM port USB cable with you to charge the device. Failing that, and depending on where you're traveling to, you might have a hard time finding a shop that will stock these cables, as they are nowhere near as widely available as a simple micro or Type-C USB cable, or Lightning. So that's just a little precaution to keep in mind. I think the last thing worth mentioning is that if we look over on the rear, we'll see an NFC logo. The nice thing here is that you can quickly and easily pair the A55 with another device over NFC, such as your mobile phone or something from Sony. I don't feel that this is a must-have feature, but it's a nice addition nonetheless. Okay, so let's delve into the UI for a bit. Oddly enough, even though it might look pretty simplistic, there is actually a fair amount going on here. On what is essentially the home screen, we've got access to quite a number of functions. Starting on the very top, we've got indicators to show us if music is currently being played, the volume level, whether Bluetooth and NFC is on, as well as a battery indicator. Just below these indicators, we get our first row of icons. The first takes you to the FM radio player. But to use this, you need to connect your headphones directly to the audio jack, as the cable acts as the antenna. Next is a language study, specifically intended for, well, language studying. Admittedly, this is not a function I have used, so exactly how this works and how effective it works is not something I could honestly comment on. The next icon is basically just a nice and easy shortcut to putting the A55 into DAC mode, which means that you can then connect it to your PC and then the A55 will act as your sound card. The last icon is somewhat similar, but this is to put the device into Bluetooth receiver mode. What this means is that you can use the A55 as a Bluetooth DAC, should you want to or need to. Then we move on down to the main panel, which allows you to browse your music library according to different criteria. You are able to select which items to show and which not by tapping on the little toolbox icon on the bottom right. But we'll take a look at this icon a bit more later on. The other thing you can do is to rearrange the order of the icons by simply tapping and holding on whichever icon you want, and then you can just drag it to a new location. I'm not going to cover each category, as most of them are pretty self-explanatory, but what you should notice is that in order to make full use of some of these items, you really need your music to be properly tagged. And that leads us to Sony's Music Center app, which can be installed on your PC. For Mac users, there is a Content Transfer for Mac app, and I did have a brief look at it, but since I don't use a Mac, I'm not in a position to say exactly how it compares to the PC version. But for what it's worth, it seems to me that the Content Transfer app relies on iTunes for handling tags and album art. But now that Apple is axing iTunes, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen with this app. In contrast, the Music Center app for PC is a complete standalone app, which you can use to fully organize your library in terms of creating playlists and getting all of the right tags and album art. Now, speaking of album art, here's something I found a little annoying about the A55. If we take a look at players from the likes of FiO, Abasso and Shanling, just to name a few, you can opt to have the album art embedded into the tags of each track, or you can simply place a single album art image into an album folder and then name it something like folder.jpg or cover.jpg. And then the player will automatically show that album art when a track within that folder is played. However, things aren't quite as simple with the Sony. In this instance, the A55 doesn't look for album art images within folders. The only way it seems to display album art is if the image is embedded into the tags. Now, this posed two issues. If you use file formats that don't support embedded album art, well, then you're a bit screwed here. I came across this issue because I recently decided to do a little battery life test with different file formats on my Sony M0, and I consistently found that I got longer battery life when using the WAV format. In case you're not familiar with this, WAV is essentially the raw digital audio format. If you're using something like a FLAC file, what the player does is to essentially convert it to WAV on the fly before it gets converted into analog audio. The advantage to storing your music in WAV then is that there is no need for the player to waste any processing power on that conversion, and so my best guess is that is why I was seeing longer playback times. But there are also two downsides to the WAV format, with the first being that it takes up significantly more space than FLAC files, and the other downside is that tags aren't as well supported as FLAC and MP3, for example. So getting back to my case, because my entire library was in WAV format and my album art images were placed in each folder, none of the album art was being showed by the A55. Okay, so after I did a little bit of digging online, it turns out that I would need to convert my library into FLAC and then embed the album art into each track individually. This is where the second issue came in, because as I was looking around on the interwebs, I came across several posts that stated that these Sony players will only show the embedded album art if the JPEG image is saved in the baseline format, not progressive. So this is something very important to keep in mind if you have to add any album art manually. But now this brings us back to the Music Center app. What I absolutely love about this is just how easy it makes library management. It will even automatically download any missing tag data as well as the correct album art images. To some extent, it's kind of like iTunes. So all I really had to do was convert my WAV library to a FLAC one and then import the new library into Music Center and wait for about an hour or so while it filled in all the tags and the album art. There's also another feature which I found quite interesting, which is called Sends Me Channels. Essentially, what this looks like to me is what Apple had on the early iPod Touches. Truth be told, the newer iPods might still have this, but it's been well over a decade since I last used one, so perhaps it's still there. But what I remember from the original iPod Touch was that it had what was called a Genius playlist, and basically what it did was to automatically create a playlist based on certain criteria. With a Sony, we've got this Sends Me Channels, which appears to work similarly. As best I can tell, it looks like the Music Center app analyzes the rhythm or tempo, or perhaps both, or something like that, for each song and then groups similar tracks into playlists. We can see these on the A55 when we go into the Sends Me channels, and these playlists are called Energetic, Emotional, Lounge, Dance, Extreme, Upbeat, Relax, Mellow, Morning, Daytime, Evening, Night, and finally Midnight. I must admit that I found myself using this feature quite a couple of times, and for the most part it's pretty accurate at keeping to the mood. So jumping back to the home screen, below the music categories are some playback buttons that allow you to easily play, pause, and skip tracks. Then below this are some other shortcuts that allow you to jump to the now playing screen or to access the settings of the device. Under settings are a few more options, such as adjusting the brightness, switching Bluetooth on and off, and then there was one feature I did look for, but I couldn't find anything relevant, and that had to do with gapless playback. But whilst it seemed like there wasn't any such feature that you could toggle manually, I did listen to a few live albums, and I really could not detect any hiccups between tracks. So that's great news, as it seems that gapless playback is essentially enabled by default. Another section of the settings I'm going to cover has to do with the sound, but before I can talk about this specific topic, let's just generally take a look at the sound character first. Where other companies such as FiO, Shanling, Ibasso, Kayan, and even Aston Kern all rely on third-party DAC and amp chips from the likes of AKM, Sabre, and Texas Instruments, Sony tend to do their own thing. As a result, the sound character I'm hearing from the A55 is a little different to what I'm used to. If I compare it to my Shanling M0, for example, the A55 seems a little warmer, softer, and more forgiving relative to the M0. The M0 seems like it offers a more neutral character and that it is able to provide seemingly better instrument separation and definition. If I listen to drum hits in particular, the M0 has a bit more of an immediate snap, whereas the A55 tends to come across a bit more impactful. But the thing is, I really couldn't tell you which one is technically the more correct one. But honestly speaking, if I had to pick between these two, I think I would pick the M0 on sound character alone. Well, actually, to be totally honest with you, that's what I would have done if I didn't start messing around with the sound settings, and in particular, I'm talking about the ClearAudio Plus setting. Sony has outfitted the A55 with a fair number of sound effects, including one which they call Vinyl Processor, which attempts to recreate the warm and rich sound usually associated with vinyl records. Then there's also VPT Surround, which is an effect that gives you the perception of a much wider stereo image. But all of the effects, including the equalizer, are disabled if you use the aforementioned ClearAudio Plus effect. What this effect does is pure magic, and I'm going to tell you up front, this effect is entirely the reason why I'm going to tell you that the A55 is the best portable player I've ever used, simply because it has allowed me to enjoy my music in a totally different manner than what I'm used to. When I first tried out this effect, I thought to myself, oh, hello, okay, this is quite different. And then I made the mistake of continuing to listen to a few more songs with it enabled. And then it happened. I turned the ClearAudio Plus effect off. I seriously could not believe how incredibly flat and boring music sounded without this effect. Like how on earth did I ever even remotely enjoy music without this in my life? Okay, no, I know, this is quite an exaggeration, but that is honestly how I felt at the time. My 58X just sounded so good, and my music collection has never sounded better, for the most part. You see, what this ClearAudio Plus effect does is to widen the stereo image and apply what seems to be a W-shaped equalization curve. Now, when I say that my music collection sounded great for the most part, the only area where I found this effect to interfere too much is when listening to a binaural album. After all, the entire point of a binaural recording is to give headphone users the most realistic stereo image, so by adding another layer of processing, that just messes around with it too much. But for the rest of my music, this effect was damn near perfect. It was almost perfect because I felt that it increased the bass just a little bit too much. But unfortunately, you cannot edit this effect manually. This got me thinking though, if I could perhaps recreate it with the other effects that are available in the settings. Maybe the ClearAudio Plus was just somewhat of a preset. And thankfully, I think I figured it out. With the help of a few frequency response measurements, I eventually got an exact match of the ClearAudio Plus effect when I used the studio setting for the VPT surround effect. I enabled the DC phase linearizer, and I set up a custom equalization curve of +6 at 60 Hz, +3 at 1 kHz, -3 at 6.3 kHz, and another +6 at 16 kHz. This was a big step, because now I could tweak the EQ curve to better suit my 58X whilst still enjoying the bigger perceived stereo image provided by the VPT surround setting. Now, I know, I'm well aware from the standpoint of audio fidelity and converting the digital audio file in the most objectively purest analog form possible, what I'm saying and doing here is totally sacrilegious. I get that, and I know I'm probably going to get flamed for this. But I honestly do not care, simply because this is the most enjoyable experience I've ever had with a portable audio product. I think it comes down to the fact that these effects, and in particular the surround effect, has given me the closest reproduction in a portable product of what my full-size sound system sounds like. Just having that perception of more space between myself and where the music is coming from made such a big impact on my overall enjoyment of listening to my music. Switching back to my Shanling M0 or any other portable DAC device, to be honest, felt so different and so disappointing, to the point where I almost wish that I had never experienced this little Sony player, because it pretty much ruined everything else for me. So now, when it comes time to discuss the value of the A55 as a portable audio product, objectively, it won't score massive points simply because it does lack numerous features such as a proper analog line-out, a relatively low power output compared to similar offerings from FiO and Shanling, as well as no Wi-Fi and certainly no direct access to streaming apps. But if we look at it purely based on the merits of a compact standalone portable player, and if that is all you need, then I honestly could not recommend or rate any other player higher than the A55 at the moment. Given the easy to use UI navigation, the super long battery life, the fantastic media library management, and then the manner in which it portrays music, albeit with the aid of various DSP effects, then the A55 really is my personal favorite portable player to date. What's more, this device is being sold for around $220 to $240, which makes it even easier to recommend as a fantastic value-packed device. If you do live near a store that stocks the A55 and you are able to demo it, then I do recommend that you do so and check out that ClearAudio Plus effect to see just what a difference it can make. Well, that's the end of the review for this sweet little device. Any questions or comments, please do leave them down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.